Starting a family is a dream for many people. Having children and nurturing them into adulthood can be fulfilling for many people, and they show their pride in their families in many ways. A mug that says "World's Greatest Dad" or a bumper sticker advertising the child as an honor student. It's not uncommon for proud parents to put their children on display at every moment, wanting the world to see their achievements. For Jeanie Wiley, though, she got no recognition because she spent 13 years locked in a room. This is Monsters. Irene Oglesby had suffered an accident when she was a child that left her with neurological damage and caused her vision to decline throughout her life. When she was in her early 20s, she worked at a soda fountain at a drugstore in Hollywood, California. There she met Clark Wiley in his early 40s, and they eventually married despite their parents' objections to the age difference. Clark had a job as a machinist in the aircraft industry, and the couple had a comfortable life financially. In all outside appearances, they seemed like an average couple, and people said Clark was smart and happy. Hidden inside of him was a deep resentment of his own mother that would eventually turn into an unhealthy connection. First, Clark was born Pearl Wiley, and he would be regularly teased because his name was considered a girl's name. Clark's mother was a single mother who spent more time working, managing brothels, and less time with him. Those details caused a great deal of animosity in the man, and when he turned 18, he legally changed his name to Clark. Those feelings were likely what contributed to him being adamant about not having children. He thought they were loud and annoying, so when Irene became pregnant, he beat her severely, as if the pregnancy was only her doing. The abuse was so severe that Irene was admitted to the hospital, where she ended up giving birth to a healthy girl. Once back home, the baby's crying bothered Clark, so he put the little girl in the garage, where she developed pneumonia and died at 10 weeks old. Irene gave birth to a boy about a year later, and that baby died of Rh incompatibility, an autoimmune condition, when he was only 2 days old. 3 years later, in 1952, Irene gave birth to a boy who also had Rh incompatibility, but he survived. John Wiley would be the first child of the couple who lived past infancy, but that was not an indication that he was treated well. His mother needed to keep him quiet so as to not aggravate his father, so his initial development was stunted. Fortunately, his paternal grandmother noticed and, believing her son was an unfit parent, took the boy in and was able to help John's development advance. That escape for John only lasted a few years, as in 1958, when he was 6 years old, his grandmother was hit by a car while crossing the street. She died in the hospital shortly after, and John returned to his parents. By that point, despite his prior issues with his mother and her current feelings about his parenting, Clark had become extremely attached to her. It's said that once he was an adult, she started trying to make up for her past neglect and would give her son anything, even supporting him financially until he got his job as a machinist in the 1940s. The loss of his mother took a huge toll on Clark mentally, but to make things worse for his family, he blamed John for her death. His mother had been crossing the road to get the boy ice cream when she was hit by a drunk driver, so clearly it was the 6-year-old's fault. That fear of being killed randomly while just going about your business led to Clark believing that his family was in constant danger. By then, the Wileys had already had another child, Susan Wiley, who would end up being known as Jeanie to the world. She was born in 1957, about a year before her grandmother's tragic accident. The girl was born healthy, but at 4 months it was found that she had a congenital hip dislocation, and she was forced to wear a restrictive brace until she was 11 months old. That was one contributing factor to her delay in learning to crawl and then walk, and because of that, it's believed Clark thought Jeanie was mentally disabled. That was why he refused to interact with the little girl, encouraging his wife and son to do the same. Jeanie was about 20 months old when Clark's mother was killed, and afterward a teenager was arrested and charged with hit and run and DUI. He was given probation, and Clark was outraged over the lack of justice his mother received. After that, Clark quit his job, moved into his mother's house, and lived as a recluse. Clark developed a disturbing sense that he had to protect his family, so he, Irene, and John slept in the living room, often with Clark holding a gun. His mother's bedroom was left undisturbed, and Jeanie got the other bedroom. That wasn't because he thought his daughter deserved a bedroom, though. It was so he could lock her away and keep her hidden from the world. Within that room during the day, Jeanie was put into a homemade straitjacket and strapped onto a child's potty. At night, she was put into a modified sleeping bag that would restrain her arms so she couldn't get out. Of course, that was if someone remembered to put her in bed, otherwise she would just stay on the toilet through the night and then throughout the next day. There was no television or radio, just the quiet of the house. There weren't even pictures on the walls and the windows were covered. There was no visual or auditory stimuli for Jeanie to experience at all. Not that she could see much in the room, as it was kept dark at all times. Even when the light was on, she never saw anything outside of the room, so her eyes never developed the ability to focus on anything past about 12 feet or 3.6 meters. Clark kept a wooden plank in the room and beat her with it if she made noise. He also terrorized her psychologically by growling and barking like a dog, and he grew his fingernails out and scratched her like an animal. He would also stand outside the door to her room and make growling noises and scratch on the door to keep her living in a state of perpetual fear. He made sure that Jeanie never heard anything else through the door by forcing Irene and John to whisper while in the house. On occasion, Jeanie would get an empty cottage cheese container or an empty thread spool to play with. Not that she could do much with it while she was strapped to the potty chair. Jeanie was given baby food, cereal, and an occasional boiled egg, but even that didn't mean she was in much contact with anyone. Clark ensured her feedings were rushed. He instructed Irene and John to shove the food in her mouth and get out of the room. If Jeanie choked or spit out the food, he told them to rub the food in her face. While Jeanie's confinement was horrifying, Clark was restrictive with the rest of the family as well. After moving to his mother's house, Clark still allowed John to go to school, but he had to prove his identity in order to be let back into the house. Clark became paranoid that someone was going to hurt his family and that isolation was the best way to keep them safe. For Jeanie, Clark believed that she was severely disabled, which was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Her development was stunted by the hip brace and by Irene keeping her quiet during early years, which caused a doctor to say he believed she was mentally disabled. That reaffirmed Clark's belief and caused him to treat her even worse, which in turn stunted her development even further. It seems that a doctor told Clark that Jeanie wouldn't live to be a teen, so he was sure she would die by the time she was 12. He told Irene that if she was still alive after her 12th birthday, he would allow her to seek medical treatment for their daughter. Of course, when her 12th birthday came and Jeanie was still alive, Clark went back on his word and continued holding his family hostage in the house. Irene lived in her own personal prison of fear and disability. As a child, she was helping her mother with the laundry, putting wet clothes through a wringer that had a hand crank. At one point, her hand slipped and the crank flew around and hit her in the head, causing a severe injury. It's not known what kind of medical treatment she received, if any, but the injury caused a detached retina in one eye. Over the years, she also suffered from cataracts, and by the time Jeanie was 13 years old, Irene was completely blind in one eye and 90% blind in the other. Beyond her physical limitations, Irene's naturally passive personality kept her from acting. Death threats kept her from reaching out to parents, friends, or authorities. Terror paralyzed Irene, making her unable to help her children. It wasn't until a violent argument broke out between Clark and Irene in October of 1970 that she finally built up the strength to stand up to her abusive husband. Irene threatened to leave unless she could contact her own parents, something she hadn't been able to do in years. Being blind, she wasn't able to dial the phone, and Clark used that to keep her isolated. After Clark gave in, he allowed her to make the call, and that started the process of unraveling the shocking secret that had been hidden in the Wiley household. That day, she took Jeanie to her parents' home in Monterey Park, California, just south of Temple City. It was there that she decided that she would leave Clark, but in order to do that, she would need support, which she would likely receive due to her disability. 3 weeks after the argument, on November 4th, 1970, she went to the Department of Social Services in Temple City. She was looking for the department that dealt with the blind, but due to that very disability, she went into the wrong office. She had brought Jeanie with her, and when she entered the General Social Services office next door, the staff immediately took notice of the small figure with her. The social worker who met them knew right away something wasn't right with the girl. They assumed she was about 6 or 7 and on the autism spectrum. Autism can be a common reason an individual is non-communicative, but the social worker quickly learned that that was not the case with Jeanie. When they began asking Irene questions about the girl, they were shocked to learn that she was actually 13. Jeanie had a hunched back and held her hands up like a rabbit. She was unable to speak, and she had almost 2 sets of teeth called hyperdontia, making her unable to swallow properly. That caused her to drool continuously. The social worker and her supervisor called the police immediately.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment. No comment.
Police arrested both Clark and Irene for child abuse and admitted Jeanie to Children's Hospital Los Angeles. John, who was 18 by then, had left home and was living with friends. Clark was released pending trial and was due to appear in court with Irene on November 20th. That morning, he laid down a piece of plastic in the living room and shot himself in the head with a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver. He left 2 notes. One was for the police and the other was for John. His note to John had instructions for his funeral. That morning, Irene appeared in court alone, where her lawyer argued that she was also a victim of Clark's abuse. During the proceedings, the judge was informed of the father's suicide, and he in turn notified the lawyers. Charges against Irene were eventually dropped, and she received counseling. From that point on, Jeanie remained in the hands of doctors and scientists who certainly wanted to help her, but more importantly, they wanted to study her. Scientists from all fields wanted a chance to study the case. Pediatricians, psychologists, linguists, and other experts across the United States asked to work with Jeanie. Researchers saw a rare chance to study how the brain and speech develop, particularly how learning language shapes human growth. Jeanie was not the first or the last child to be discovered with severely stunted development due to neglect, but in 1970 she was the first child who had been isolated so severely that was available to study. The most famous case of a feral child prior to Jeanie was Victor of Aveyron, who was found at around the age of 9 in France in 1797. He was captured and lived with a woman for about a week but ran away. He was captured again a few years later and eventually taken in by a young medical student who tried to quote-unquote civilize him, but Victor never progressed past rudimentary level reading and writing. He died of pneumonia when he was about 40. Alice Marie Harris, who was reported under the alias Anna, was discovered in 1938 in Perryopolis, Pennsylvania. She was 6 years old at the time of her discovery and had been strapped down in the attic of her home, abused because she was an illegitimate child. She had been given just enough food to keep her alive for most of her life. She was rescued at 6, where she had rickets, could not speak, and showed no signs of intelligence. She was almost incapable of holding her attention for more than a few seconds. She died at age 10 due to hemorrhagic jaundice. Dina Sanichar was discovered in a cave in Uttar Pradesh, India in 1867. He had been living among wolves. He was sent to an orphanage where he would walk on all fours and eat raw meat. He never learned to speak, but he did take up smoking after having lived around other human beings for a while, so congratulations to his caretakers for that. He died of tuberculosis when he was around 35 and would end up being the inspiration for Mowgli in the Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. Those and other stories of past feral children had been known to scientists, but with Jeanie they had a chance to study a real child who had been completely deprived of language during her development up to puberty. Language tests in December of 1970 showed just how severe Jeanie's communication problems were. Susan Curtis, a UCLA graduate student who became key to Jeanie's case, saw that Jeanie used gestures and emotional expressions to communicate instead of words. She knew only 20 words, mostly negative phrases like "stop it" and "no more." Standard tests showed that Jeanie's mental abilities were much higher than anyone first thought. While her verbal skills matched a 1-year-old, she did way better on nonverbal tests. She showed amazing spatial awareness and could recognize things by touch. That meant her brain kept developing despite her extreme isolation. While Jeanie struggled with speaking, she found clever ways to communicate without words. She built up a rich set of gestures and became fluent in using facial expressions to show complex emotions. The team watched as she learned to mime her wants through body language. Jeanie showed some remarkable sensory skills too. She could match fabrics by touch with her eyes closed and identify objects just by feeling their shape. On top of that, she had an amazing visual memory and could recognize people she'd met briefly months before. Jeanie started to learn individual words quickly in her first 7 months after discovery. She could put together simple 2-word phrases by July of 1971, and by November she had moved on to 3-word combinations. Her vocabulary grew faster than expected, reaching about 200 words before she started making sentences. Yet her language development showed a clear split. While she picked up words impressively, Jeanie struggled substantially with grammar. She never learned to ask questions or follow grammatical rules. Her language hit a wall at 2- and 3-word combinations even after 4 years of intensive work with researchers. When describing the abuse she suffered at the hand of her father, she would say things like, quote, "Father hit big stick," and quote, "Father take piece wood hit." Susan Curtis saw that gap between word learning and grammar skills and said, quote, "She has less difficulty in storing lists than she does learning the rules of the grammar. This illustrates very sharply that language acquisition is not simply the ability to store a large number of items in memory." The scientific research around Jeanie showed great promise until her living situation became unstable. She made good progress during her original hospital stay, but a series of disruptions in her care ended up undoing much of her early development. Jean Butler, one of Jeanie's teachers, became protective of her in 1971. A measles outbreak meant Jeanie needed quarantine at Butler's home. Butler then started keeping Jeanie away from linguist Susan Curtis and psychologist James Kent. That worried other team members who thought Butler had personal motives beyond Jeanie's well-being. Some researchers pointed out that Butler called herself the next Anne Sullivan, a reference to Helen Keller's famous teacher. That suggested she wanted recognition through her work with Jeanie. The research team's relationship began to fall apart. Team members saw Butler's actions as harmful to Jeanie's progress in their scientific study. The authorities rejected Butler's request to become Jeanie's permanent foster parent. After that, psychologist David Rigler and his wife Marilyn took Jeanie into their home. She lived with them for about 4 years. That brought some stability and led to slow but steady progress. Jeanie showed positive signs in the Rigler home. She loved classical piano music and became passionate about drawing. Art became her quickest way to communicate. Unfortunately, that living situation raised more ethical concerns. David Rigler got a major grant from the National Institutes of Mental Health to study language while he was Jeanie's foster parent. His wife Marilyn received both foster family money and funding toward her graduate degree for her work with Jeanie. Rigler defended the arrangement by saying, quote, Someone had to meet the research needs and someone had to take care of Jeanie's therapy, and I did both. The project hit a major obstacle in 1974 when the National Institute of Mental Health pulled its funding. Jeanie went back to live with her birth mother in 1975. Her mother had been cleared of all child abuse charges, but despite having her sight restored through surgery, Irene couldn't handle Jeanie's care needs. That started a sad cycle as Jeanie moved between foster homes where she faced more abuse and neglect. The damage to Jeanie's development was severe. Things got worse when Irene sued Children's Hospital Los Angeles and the research team in 1979. She claimed they had used her daughter to gain prestige and profit instead of putting her welfare first. The lawsuits specifically targeted researchers for conducting too many tests that might have gotten in the way of Jeanie's treatment. The parties settled the case in 1984, which cut off all contact between Jeanie and the scientists who had studied her. In 1978, Irene had banned Jeanie from participating in any scientific observation. Scientists were overly enthusiastic about studying Jeanie because they had no other means of being able to study someone in her condition. They couldn't ethically deprive a child of human contact in order to study their development under or after those conditions. They needed to use what had been presented to them naturally in order to advance their knowledge. Psycholinguist Harlan Lane put it this way, quote, "If you want to do rigorous science, then Jeanie's interests are going to come second some of the time. If you only care about helping Jeanie, then you wouldn't do a lot of the scientific research." One researcher later admitted, quote, "What I saw happen with Jeanie was a pretty crass form of exploitation. She was exploited extrafamilially just as she was exploited intrafamilially, just by a different cast of characters." State institutions became Jeanie's home by the late 1970s. Reports say she faced severe physical and emotional abuse there. As of 2024, Jeanie would be 66 or 67 years old if she's still alive. The state of California maintains guardianship over her, and officials keep her location and condition private. The authorities turn down media requests consistently, pointing to privacy rules. A private investigator found her in 2000 at an adult care facility. The conditions were poor, but she seemed content according to reports. Jeanie's brother saw her last in 1982. He lost touch with their mother, who passed away in 2003. In a 2008 interview, John said, quote, "I feel at times God failed me. Maybe I failed him." He eventually moved to Ohio and became a house painter. Despite Jeanie's story captivating many people around the world, children continue to be rescued from isolation. In 2005, 7-year-old Danielle Crockett was discovered in a filth-covered house in Plant City, Florida. She had been locked in a room filled with dirty diapers and deprived of human contact her entire life. Also in the home were her mother and 2 older brothers. She was rushed to a hospital where she was taken care of physically, but she would never recover emotionally or psychologically. She lived in a group home for a while and didn't learn to talk while there. Danielle was adopted in 2007 and gradually learned how to carry out simple tasks. She started responding to her name and has learned how to laugh, something she deserved to do often for the rest of her life. Her mother, Michelle Crockett, pleaded guilty to child neglect, signed away her parental rights, and was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest. She died in 2020. Fortunately for the girl, who now goes by Danny, she was not seen as a subject that could be studied. She underwent tests, but those were to try and identify her medical conditions so doctors knew how to best treat her. Then she was adopted, and her priority was her development. For most people, the story of Jeanie Wiley is a distant tale that's more of an urban legend than a reality. But it was reality. It was the reality of a young girl for the first 13 years of her life. It was the reality that, after her rescue, the effort to study her may have taken priority over helping her. And it's the reality that, even to this day, Jeanie is still locked away. Maybe not in a dark bedroom, but still restricted from access to the world. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.